is scheduled to carry out 2 executions on the same day next week. It is the first time that has happened in more than 60 years. The cases involve 2 men convicted nearly 40 years ago. They raise broader questions about punishment, appeals, changing evidence, and how the justice system decides when a case is truly finished. For James Duckett and Dominick Occhicone, decades of appeals are coming to an end. The final stages of these 2 cases raising very different questions. Duckett was convicted in the 1987 killing of 11-year-old Teresa Maccabee in Lake County. He's maintained his innocence for nearly 40 years. His attorneys argue that evidence used to secure his conviction, including forensic hair analysis and witness testimony, deserves renewed scrutiny as standards of scientific evidence have evolved. The state argues the conviction has been examined repeatedly through appeals, and the governor is standing by that review process.
I still have a responsibility to look at these cases and to be sure that the person's guilty. And if I honestly thought somebody wasn't, I would not pull the trigger on it.
Occhicone's case presents a different set of questions. He was convicted of killing Raymond and Martha Artzner in their holiday home in 1986. Now 80 years old, Occhicone's attorneys argue that his age and serious medical conditions make his execution unconstitutional. The courts have rejected those arguments. His case also reflects changes in Florida's death penalty system. His death sentence was recommended by a 7-5 jury vote. Under current Florida law, at least 8 jurors must recommend a death sentence before it can be imposed. Together, the cases raise fundamental questions in criminal justice. When a conviction is decades old, how does the system balance the need for an end with the possibility that new information could change what we know? How should courts consider evidence that changes over time? And after decades have passed, what does justice require? Those questions are once again at the center of Florida's debate over the death penalty. Dan, I'd like to start with you on critics on both sides, critics and supporters of the death penalty as a punishment, are talking about, is justice delayed, justice denied? Should these cases, they talk about fairness, evolving science, decade-long delays. A lot of hard questions are being considered by both sides. As Florida carries out another round of executions, where do you see these hard questions landing?
Well, I think, there's a lot of strong feelings on both sides of the issue. With Duckett's case, obviously, there's the question of, did they get the right guy? And, has he been given enough due process, to prove that he's innocent as he says he is? With Occhicone's case, there's the bigger questions of, is it right to put this man to death when he is, elderly and suffering from various medical conditions? And it's a difficult question that, a lot of people have wrestled with. At the same time, there is, that question of when is enough? And, a jury, 2 juries a long time ago said that these men should die. And, is it time to do that? I think those are all legitimate questions.
And these are stories that you've been following for a number of years. Both of these death row inmates have been waiting for decades for finality in their cases. What does it actually look like inside a case that's taking so long, the decades long?
Well, I think with both of these cases, when you look at the case itself, you see that a lot of their appeals and a lot of the due process has already kind of been ironed out and resolved, years ago. Occhicone in particular, I think his appeals were pretty much exhausted by about 2006, and that's why you see now that his death warrant has been signed, his appeals now focus more on, is it ethical and moral to put him to death now that he's elderly and ill? Whereas with Duckett, it's more of a question of, did we really get the right person? And, have have we really examined all the forensic evidence that might be there that can prove that this was the right person?
Because Duckett is challenging the evidence that was presented in the case, and then you have the governor saying this has been tried and convicted already, and the governor went as far as to say if he honestly believed that someone was innocent, that he would not proceed. How does this get resolved before Tuesday?
Well, with Mr. Duckett's case, he does still have appeals pending. I believe at this moment he still has an appeal pending before the Florida Supreme Court. He also has filed something in federal court challenging the sufficiency of the DNA testing that he was granted. He was granted some DNA testing earlier this year after the governor first signed his death warrant. And while that testing was ongoing, the Florida Supreme Court issued him a stay of execution. And the testing later came back inconclusive, and now there's some argument going on about, was the right kind of testing done, and is there more evidence that we can examine that might give us, more of a conclusive answer?
Mitch, when you wrote your story last week on this, you looked at the bigger picture, what's been happening with death penalty cases in Florida during the last 19 months. Tell us what you've seen when you look at the big picture and what's revealed in this pace.
Well, Governor Ron DeSantis is on a prolific rate of signing execution death warrants in a pace that not only we haven't seen in Florida ever, but really almost unprecedented nationally in terms of how many. This will be, if these go off on Tuesday, there will be the 11th and 12th people executed this year, which is roughly, I believe, more than 50% of all executions that have happened in the United States this year. Last year, there was 19 executions. That was 40%. So we are doing as much as the rest of the country, half as much as the rest of the country right now. And there hasn't been really a lot of focus on this about why the governor is doing this. I mean, he's been in office for 7.5 years. It's only in the last year and a half this pace has really picked up. There are hundreds of people on death row, so it's just interesting why he's really pushing this now in his last part of his term in office.
You've also covered the legislature, moving to expand who's eligible for the death penalty in Florida. The pace that you've just talked about with Governor DeSantis, what is driving all of this? Well,
when it comes to, so let's look at what's happened in Florida. Yeah, they did a couple years ago pass legislation basically challenging something that's unconstitutional right now, which is to try to execute somebody who wasn't killed somebody. Back in, I think it was 2008, Justice Kennedy, it was a Kennedy, Louisiana case, basically said it can only be an execution for somebody who's, I'm roughly saying this, has killed somebody else. What I'm saying is that there's a law now that says child rapists are eligible for the death penalty. And there's a couple cases that have actually now are going through the court system here. I believe James Uthmeier, Attorney General, last fall wrote to then Attorney General Pam Bondi and said, can the Trump administration change the law on this? Ultimately, this would, if in fact we pursue this, it will probably go to the U.S. Supreme Court, have to go to the Supreme Court, because they're the ones who put the precedent down that says you really can't expand beyond what we do right now, the death penalty.
I think viewers will be surprised to know that in your story last week, you wrote about the man that was executed last week. He wanted Governor DeSantis to be there when it happened.
That's right, Dennis Soker, who was executed a week and a half ago. He basically, his spiritual advisor told the press that he wanted basically the governor to see an execution in person. The fact that he's writing some of these death warrants in the, as you could say, the comfort of his office in Tallahassee, and hasn't actually seen the stark reality of what happens when somebody dies by the state. It's a huge responsibility. It's a huge thing, whether you support the death penalty or you don't. Right now, I believe it's 23 states do not do the death penalty, but actually it's 27 because 4 states which have a moratorium on right now. So the majority of states in the country don't do this right now. The most recent Gallup poll had this, I believe 53% do still support the death penalty in the United States, but that's the lowest it's been since the 90s actually. So, it's kind of against the pace of what the rest of the country is doing right now.